What if you could step back in time and talk with some of Kansas City's most historic figures? The innovators and achievers who left their mark on our town, on our nation. What would you ask if you could meet the past? This week, Crosby chats with President Harry S. Truman, the boy from Lamar, Missouri, whose occupations ranged from soldier and haberdasher to senator, and ultimately, our nation's chief executive.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's conversation is with a man who indeed needs no introduction to those of us from Kansas City, from Jackson County. So I'd just like you to welcome the man from Independence, Harry S. Truman.
Thank you.
Mr. President, it is great to have you back, and you're looking awfully good. We haven't seen you look this good since November 3rd, 1948. There were a lot of people who said you couldn't do it.
That's true. That was a great day, I'll tell you.
How did you do it? The polls said had you way behind. What I want to know, though, is how did you do this?
I'll tell you how we did it. The Republicans got control of Congress in 1946. And I refer to that Congress as the do-nothing, good-for-nothing Republican 80th Congress. The Democrats didn't want me to run. A lot of them didn't. My popularity had plummeted. They wanted General Eisenhower to run. And at any rate, I thought, I'm going to fight for this, because I believe in our foreign policy. I believed in our civil rights record. So I went to that convention. And we insisted on a voting rights bill and an anti-lynching bill in the platform. As a result...
Didn't make everybody happy, did it?
No, it didn't. J. Strom Thurmond and some of the Southern delegations walked out and created the Dixiecrat Party or the States' Rights Party. But I just want to say this one.
You were too liberal for the Dixiecrats, but you were a little too conservative for
the Wallaceites, the group that went off to the left. But I stood before that convention. Now, I didn't get to the podium until 2 o'clock in the morning, which was prime time in Guam.
You did so well.
But I stood there and I looked out over that wonderful convention and I said, there'll be a Democrat in the White House for the next 4 years, and you're looking at him.
So, Mr. President, you went off on your whistle-stop campaign.
That's correct.
A famous campaign. Tell us about that. How did that
turn
the tide?
It was the Ferdinand Magellan. We traveled 37,000 miles. I gave about 200 speeches on the record, 200 speeches off the record. We gave them hell. People would say, give them hell. And I said, we just tell the truth, and they think it's hell. But we talked about civil rights. We talked about a national health insurance program for all Americans that I had mentioned in the 1947 State of the Union address. Now, I was running against Tom Dewey, the only man I ever knew who could strut sitting down. He was pretty wooden. Now, he was the governor of the state with the most electoral votes. His running mate, do you remember?
Earl Warren was his running mate?
He was the governor of the state with the third most electoral votes.
California.
Yes, sir. We had Strom Thurmond taking the South. We had Wallace. We didn't have a chance to win this. But I talked to the American people face to face, about 2 million of them. Every poll said we would lose that election.
So you're back in Independence on election night. You go off to the Elms. All by yourself.
I actually stopped down at the Mulebach to see the boys, but they were pretty glum because no way we were going to win this. Went over to the Elms, checked in with a few Secret Service men, had a ham and cheese sandwich, glass of buttermilk, a steam, and went to bed. And along about 10 o'clock, I woke up and I tuned in National Broadcasting Company, and there was the clipped, authoritative voice of H.V. Keltenborn. And he was saying, well, the president is ahead by 1.5 million votes, but when all the votes come in, he will be undoubtedly defeated. So I turned the radio off and went back to sleep.
Hard to believe you go back to sleep. So you wake up in the morning, you come down to the Mulebach.
That's correct.
To election headquarters.
Lyman Fields was it?
My friend Lyman Field, Kansas City's version of Clarence Darrow, was there, and another lawyer, Jerome Walsh. And they're the first people to see you. And Lyman Field said to David McCullough at one point that you came in and you were the same old Harry Truman, that there was no gloating, there was no glory, that you just took off your coat and you got down to work. You were Mr. Independence.
That's correct. We had a job to do. I was very grateful to the American people. And
but though there was no gloating then, there was that moment maybe the next day. Mr. President, this is the second time we've met. I met you when I was about 7 or 8 years old. There was a Jackson County Historical Society meeting, and my father took me to meet you. He wanted me to meet the President of the United States, and you met me, and you patted me on the head, and you gave me a piece of advice, actually, too. You said, young man, I just have 2 pieces of advice for you. Don't become a Republican and don't become a banker.
That's correct, yeah.
Well, Mr. President, now I'm a librarian, so and here we are.
You're
in
doing
a
a great job.
Well, bless you, my son. Back as you were growing up in Independence, and books were very important to you. In fact, we've got this book here that it was very important, maybe the most important book to you, Great Men and Famous Women, about the great figures of history.
Reading these 4 volumes was a turning point in my life because I realized how important history was. And in the Truman House, we also read the classics. We read Shakespeare, we read Mark Twain, we read the Bible, and interestingly enough, regularly we read the Congressional Record.
Exciting reading.
That way we followed the debates that were going on in the House and the Senate.
But your introduction to politics, actually, there's another family moment for me. Your introduction to politics was actually the 1900 Democratic National Convention held in Kansas City. Your father was invited to sit in the box of W.T. Kemper, my great-grandfather.
He was a friend of your great-grandfather.
Right, and you were a page.
And yes, and that was quite an experience to attend that convention. The convention nominated William Jennings Bryan for a 2nd term, and to see 17,000 people in one place was amazing.
And talking about wonderful books and great moments, your great friend from Independence High School, Charlie Ross,
absolutely.
And you edited something called The Gleam, the literary magazine of Independence High School. And The Gleam is a phrase that's taken from a great poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And it's a poem that you carried in your wallet for the rest of your life.
That's correct, in my billfold.
Do you still have a copy of Locksley Hall?
I do. I copied this down in 1901, and this caught my attention, and it was so prophetic in considering the career that I ended up having. For I dipped into the future, far as human eye could see, saw the vision of the world and all the wonder that would be, saw the heavens fill with commerce, argosies of magic sails, pilots of the purple twilight dropping down with costly bales, till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled. In the Parliament of Man, the federation of the world, there the common sense of most shall hold a fretful realm in awe, and the kindly earth shall slumber, lapped in universal law.
So here you have this vision of the wonders of the world and the Parliament of Man, and what do? Your first serious job, you went to work for Commerce Bank. and you leave the banking business and you go on to the farm.
That's
and
true.
The farm seems to have taught you the family farm with your father. You're in business with your father, J. Truman and Sons.
Absolutely. I became a partner with my father on the family farm in 1906. There was nothing more peaceful in this world than riding behind a mule, plowing a field. Gives a man time to think. My mother said it gave me my common sense. That's what I think about farming.
Common sense. So, Mr. President, World War I comes along, and you win your first election. Battery D, they elect you because they elected officers, then they elect you a lieutenant.
Correct.
And you meet some pretty interesting folks who are very important to you later on in your life.
Absolutely.
In that Battery D.
Well, we went to Camp Doniphan at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, and I met
Eddie Jacobson?
Eddie Jacobson, thank you. I'm getting up there.
Jim Pendergast?
Eddie Jacobson became a lifelong friend of mine, and also Jim Pendergast was Tom Pendergast's nephew. And Eddie and I operated a canteen, and we did so well, we decided once we came back from overseas, if we did come back, we'd go into business together, because there was no way Mrs. Wallace was going to let her daughter, Bess, marry a Missouri dirt farmer. So I had to look for a different occupation.
So you put some money, borrowed some money, put some money into a haberdashery with Eddie Jacobson. The haberdashery failed pretty quickly, the recession of 1921.
We did pretty well for 3 years. We had a national economic recession in 1921, but we did go bankrupt.
But fortunately, another friend from Battery D, you mentioned him before, Jim Pendergast, introduced you to the Pendergast family. And at that point, Boss Pendergast was a pretty important guy in Kansas City. He pretty much controlled everything. And he was looking around for a candidate for Eastern Judge of Jackson County. And
that's correct.
He wanted a veteran and asked you if you wanted to run for Eastern Jackson County Judge, and you won.
That's correct.
And here you are working with the most notorious boss in America. And yourself being, I think, a pretty honest guy. What was that like?
Well, let me tell you about my relationship with Tom. First of all, we were different people. He was a city boy, I was a country boy. He was a Roman Catholic, I was a Southern Baptist, and as you well know, I carried poetry in my billfold. Mr. Pendergast didn't. Tom said the darndest thing to me when I first met him, when I was running for Eastern Judge. He said, "Harry, there are 3 sides to every question in politics. Your side, my side, and the right side." Now, I decided from that moment on to go for the right side. And talking about decisions, I made decisions the only way I knew how. Did what I thought was right, and based what I thought was right on my knowledge and appreciation of history, right here. I never took a bribe, and I could have.
Well,
so I remained honest. Didn't mean occasionally something happened that shouldn't have happened.
You became the biggest road builder in America. There are only 2 counties in America, Wayne County, which was Detroit. In those days they
Westchester.
were building things in Detroit, and Westchester County. And you built more roads except for those 2 counties than any other county in America.
And let me tell you, that was a big deal, to build the 3rd best county road system in the United States. We had a bond issue.
Well, particularly since a lot of the road building contractors were Tom Pendergast.
Yeah, that's true. But now let me give you an example. Let me give you an example of the right side. That we had 2 bond issues, one in 1928 and one in 1931. Now, Tom got behind me on the bond issue, knowing full well that most of the people, the majority of people that vote in Jackson County live in Kansas City. So they weren't going to vote for this, but I campaigned with the people in Kansas City and pointed out to them that roads go both directions. People could come from the country and spend money in the city. People in the city could take a ride in the country. Plus, we needed roads to the farmer. I did not take Pendergast's bid. We took a bid from a company in South Dakota. That was the right side. Now, I got into a lot of trouble over that.
Right.
You can imagine.
Tom brought some of those contractors to you and asked what it would take to get the bid, and you said, be the low bid.
That's correct. Yeah. That's correct.
Yeah. So despite the fact that you weren't really helpful to the Centropolis Public Service Paving Company of Mr. Pendergast, he made you a United States Senator. You were elected to the Senate in 1934, right. And you were called the Senator from Pendergast. You weren't taken terribly seriously until you gave a speech in 1937. And I think this speech that you gave on Wall Street about what was going on Wall Street is kind of interesting in light of what's going on today. Have you got a copy of that speech,
I have a copy of it.
Mr.
By
President?
the way, there was a cartoon in the Kansas City Star back then, and it showed me on the telephone, and I had calluses on my ears from long-distance telephone calls from Tom, telling me what to do.
She never did.
We worship money instead of honor. A billionaire, in our estimation, is much greater in these days in the eyes of the people than the public servant who works for public interest. We worship mammon, and until we go back to ancient fundamentals and return to the giver of the tables of law and his teachings, these conditions are going to remain with us. It is a pity that Wall Street, with its ability to control all the wealth of the nation and to hire the best law brains in the country, has not produced some statesmen, some men who could see the dangers of bigness and of the concentration of the control of wealth. Instead of working to meet the situation, they are still employing the best law brains to serve greed and self-interest.
Well, Mr. President, you'll be happy to know things have completely changed with Wall Street since then.
I hope so.
You got to have a reputation. You created the Truman Committee during World War II that helped look at some corruption among the
what we wanted
contractors.
to do is investigate the National Defense Program. We did it before Pearl Harbor. What we wanted to do was avoid waste and corruption in the National Defense Program. This put me on the map. It put me on the cover of Time magazine.
And so the president wanted to get rid of Henry Wallace as his vice president, and the convention is kind of an open convention, but you're chosen as a vice presidential candidate in 1944, become vice president of the United States in January, have only 2 meetings with the president of the United States while you're vice president, and he dies.
That's correct. You want to know about that day?
Absolutely.
April 12th, 1945, I was presiding over the United States Senate. Steve Early, President Roosevelt's press secretary, called me and asked me to come over quickly and quietly to the White House. Now, I knew that Roosevelt was ill, and I thought I probably would be president. I didn't think it was that day. And I went up the stairs, and Ms. Roosevelt was standing there, and she put her hand on my shoulder, and she said, "Harry, we have bad news. The president died today in Warm Springs." And I was stunned. And I said to her, I said, "Oh, Ms. Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you?" And she said, "Harry, the question is there anything we can do for you? Because you're the one in trouble now." Now, I was sworn in by Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone at 7:09 that evening. And I will tell you this, my first decision was to go ahead with the conference in San Francisco to write a charter and create the United Nations.
The Parliament of Man.
Parliament of Man from Locksley Hall. Roosevelt's last words that he wrote right before he had a cerebral hemorrhage, "The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today."
Now, Mr. President, you become president with virtually no knowledge of what's going on in the war, our foreign policy, and you're given this decision almost immediately about whether or not to use the atomic bomb, to go ahead with the test and then whether or not to use it. That must have been the toughest decision of your life.
No, my most difficult decision of my presidency was committing troops to Korea. But certainly that was the second most difficult. But George Marshall, who I regarded as the most important American of the 20th century, I used to say there's not a medal big enough. He and Secretary of War Stimson and Bradley told me that if there was a land invasion on the home islands of Japan, we could lose between 250,000 and 500,000 additional Americans in the war. All through World War II, not one Japanese unit surrendered. There was no word for surrender in the Japanese language. The incendiary bombing that was going on throughout Japan already and would continue if we didn't have used the bombs would kill far more people. Crosby, I'm going to tell you this. It wasn't just a military alternative for me. It was a moral alternative.
And that decision made, you then made a series of decisions that really created the modern world that we live in. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan to put Europe back on its feet and to fight communism and the Russians in the Cold War. You refused to drop the bomb as MacArthur wanted to during the Korean War.
May I just say one thing?
Sure.
While we're there? Sorry to interrupt you.
Mr. President, it's your show.
We eventually were involved in the Cold War. We had a new adversary. I was not going to be responsible for World War III. I did not want to go to the war with the Russians, and I wanted to keep it a Cold War, and I never wanted to use those bombs again. We felt we could win the Cold War economically, and we came up with a policy of containment. We would contain the Soviet Union. The Truman Doctrine kept Greece and Turkey out of their sphere of interest. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild Europe economically. And I said at the time that their system would implode in 50 years. I don't know if that happened, but that was my comment at the time.
Well, I wanted to ask you about it. Thank you. Another difficult decision, and maybe one more difficult because where you came from, your family was. Your mother, when you was asked if she wanted to sleep in if she was looking forward to sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom, said she'd rather sleep on the floor than sleep in Lincoln's bed because she was a dyed-in-the-wool Confederate.
That's true.
Well,
she had good reason to be.
Well, Mr. President, but you created the first Civil Rights Commission. You desegregated the armed forces. You proposed anti-lynching laws and anti-poll tax laws, invited the first black Americans to attend an inauguration, which 60 years later looks like an interesting precedent.
I was the first president to address the NAACP. And what I said is, there is no justification for discrimination against ancestry, color, race, or religion. And
the American people, when you left office, had a pretty low opinion of you. You left office with a lower opinion rating than any other president, including some recent presidents. Winston Churchill, in his last meeting with you, who, along with George Marshall, is one of maybe your two great heroes, said to you, he said, "I must confess, sir, I held you in very low regard the first time we met. I loathed your taking the place of Franklin Roosevelt. I misjudged you badly since that time. You, more than any other man, have saved Western civilization." And you retired, perhaps knowing that, perhaps not, but like Cincinnatus, your hero from the days of your youth, you went back to 219 North Delaware as a private citizen, driving yourself and Bess around, walking to the Truman Library as a plain Mr. Citizen. That's pretty extraordinary.
Well, fortunately, I did have a historical perspective, and I was able to look back at history. And these things happened to other presidents and other people. I felt what we had done, I made mistakes, but I felt our policies were good, and ultimately that would be appreciated. Arthur Schlesinger said that history is to a nation what memory is to the individual. If a nation forgets its history, it is disabled. And I used to say, the only thing new in the world is the history we haven't read. All readers cannot be leaders, but all leaders better be readers. So I had this historical perspective to look back on. Now, I admired Cincinnatus. He was an incredible fella. He knew how and when to give up power after he saved the Republic and returned to the plow. Washington, who I admired greatly, knew how and when to give up power after he helped create our republic and return to the plow. And when we talked about civil rights, I look at the Lincoln. Lincoln said, and this involves what you just said, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. So those words resonated with me all the time.
Mr. President, I want to say of you, as Dean Acheson said of you, you are a captain with a mighty heart.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Harry Truman.
Harry Truman was a great president. I believe the historians now have him rating as number 5. But for me personally, when I was a young boy, I wrote to Mr. Truman and he would always write back to me. So we had a bit of a correspondence as I was growing up. I also had an opportunity to meet with him. But more important, he instilled in me the importance and the love of history.
To learn more about President Harry S. Truman, reading lists and more can be found at the Kansas City Public Library or at kclibrary.org.